Chapter 4 The History of Canada, Part 1 Aboriginal Peoples. The first people to live in Canada were the Aboriginals. Early European explorers called them Indians because these explorers thought they had reached the East Indies. All of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada were hunters, but different groups made a living in different ways, depending on where they lived. Many lived in permanent or semi-permanent villages. The Huron-Wendat and the Iroquois lived by the Great Lakes. They farmed as well as hunted. The Cree and Dene lived in the northwest. They were hunters and gatherers. Gatherers are people who pick berries, seeds, and native plants to eat. The Sioux, who lived in the prairie region, were also hunters and gatherers. They followed the bison or buffalo herds. The Inuit lived in the Arctic region of Canada and lived off Arctic wildlife. The people of the West Coast caught fish and dried or smoked them. War between Aboriginal peoples was common, as groups fought each other for land, resources, or glory. Europeans. When the Europeans came, the lives and cultures of the Aboriginals changed forever. Many died from diseases brought from Europe. However, Europeans and Aboriginals did learn to work and live together, forming strong economic, religious, and military ties. The first Europeans to come to Canada were not the French or the English. The Vikings came from Iceland 1,000 years ago, 500 years before other Europeans. The Vikings had settlements in Greenland. From there, they were able to explore the coasts of Newfoundland and Labrador. Then they built a settlement in Newfoundland. No one knows for sure why the Vikings left Canada, but they only stayed in Newfoundland for a few years. Remains from their settlement have been found in L'Anse-aux-Meadows in northern Newfoundland. It is now a World Heritage Site. 500 years passed before a European came to North America again, and that was by accident. European explorers were actually looking for China and India. In 1497, John Cabot sailed from England and claimed Newfoundland for the English. He was the first person to draw a map of the east coast of Canada. 35 years later, in 1534, Jacques Cartier arrived and claimed the land he explored for France. He made 3 voyages and explored the country along the St. Lawrence River, as far as Quebec City and Montreal. He heard a group of Aboriginals say the word Kanata, and he thought that was the name of the country. It actually meant village. By the 1500s, Europeans were calling the whole country Canada. Early settlement. In the beginning, Europeans were mainly interested in trading furs with the Aboriginals. They did not want to live in the country. They would travel across the ocean in the spring and go back to Europe in the fall. Around 1600, the King of France and the fur trading companies decided to build permanent settlements. Private companies were formed to bring colonists and missionaries. In 1604, the first French settlement was established by Samuel de Champlain and Pierre de Monts at Port Royal in Acadia, now the province of Nova Scotia. Champlain stayed in Port Royal for 3 years, but the settlement was not easy to defend from the British, who had colonies to the south. Also, the weather could be bad. Champlain went looking for a new place to build. The Acadian settlement was not abandoned, though. It grew into a prosperous farming settlement. You read about what happened to the Acadians in Who We Are, Chapter 3. In 1608, Champlain decided to build his second settlement further inland on the St. Lawrence River. This second settlement is now Quebec City. Just like it was in Acadia, the first winter was very difficult. The weather was very cold, and there was a lot of snow. Champlain and his men did not know where to find food or what animals to hunt. This time, however, Champlain became friends with the Indians who lived in the region. They taught Champlain and his men how to survive. Champlain allied his colony with the Algonquin, the Montagnais, and the Huron. These tribes were enemies of the Iroquois, who were allied with the English colonies to the south. Both the French and the English got the Indian people to help them fight their wars with each other. At first, mostly men lived in the colony of New France. After 50 years, the settlement was still very small. The King of France decided to take control of the colony away from the private companies. He established a new government in New France. Jean Talon, Count Frontenac, and Bishop Laval were important early officials. They encouraged the settlers to build farms and businesses, and they worked with the Aboriginal people in the fur trade. Beaver furs were especially wanted in Europe. Using the rivers and lakes of Canada, they built a French fur trading empire in North America that extended from Hudson Bay to the Gulf of Mexico. King Louis also sent young women from France to marry the young men. They were called filles du roi, or daughters of the king. Today, most of the French families in Quebec are descended from these original families. Questions. In which parts of Canada did European people first live? Number 2. Who were the first Europeans to come to Canada? Where did they build their settlement? 3. When and why did the second group of Europeans come to Canada? 4. Who was the first person to draw a map of Canada's east coast? 5. How were the Aboriginal people affected by the arrival of Europeans? 6. Where does the name Canada come from? 7. Who was Samuel de Champlain? Where did he build his first settlement? 8. When did settlers first build settlements on the St. Lawrence River? 9. Which Aboriginal groups were allies of the French? Who were their enemies? 10. How did French leaders such as Jean Talon, Bishop Laval, and Count Frontenac build a French empire in North America?